Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to be looking at more of a low-key kind of color grade. And so a lot of this stuff will actually feel pretty familiar because we're going to use the same tools that we've already talked about. We're just going to kind of go through this as an example of working on a low-key shot. So as you can imagine, we're going to try and make this even moodier. So I mean, it's already fairly low-key, but I want to make it even more kind of contrasty, moody. As we've been doing throughout, we've been using the black and white layer on multiply. We're going to do something similar, but we're going to take a little spin on it. We're actually going to use the channel mixer in this case. There's really no huge difference between this and the black and white, other than it gives you a couple of kind of out-of-the-box filter options that will vary the intensity within the skin. So if we go into channel mixer and we select the multiply blending mode, then what we want to do is go in and select one of these presets here. So there's a bunch of presets for black and white, and that's what we're going to be using. So if, for example, we go black and white with blue filter, then let's take this to something. You know what? Let's start it off with just normal here, so you can see what the difference is. So the black and white with blue filter is going to be fairly dark, and that really just kind of goes off the blue channel. The blue channel is always kind of that dark channel, and so it's going to give you the highest, and I guess strongest effect within your shadows, and often many times within the skin as well. It'll create the sort of most dramatic, I guess, multiplying effect that you can get out of all of them. So I don't typically use this one too often, just because it really does darken down so much information, and obviously we're going to reduce the opacity at which we're doing this, but it's still, I find, maybe not the best choice. Now if we go into the green filter, you can see that this one is actually quite neutral. So basically it gives a pretty good balance of everything, I find. It does a nice job in the shadows and the highlights and the skin. It's just fairly neutral throughout. And orange filter, again, it's going to give you a little bit more brightness in the skin because skin contains a lot of orange. Red filter is going to be even brighter, so it's going to be very small effect within the skin areas, especially the skin highlight areas. You're not really going to see much of that multiplying effect that you saw with the black and white layer. And then the yellow filter is, I find it's kind of similar to the orange one. If we kind of jump between those, you can see it's a little bit darker than the orange filter because, again, skin tends to contain a little bit more orange than it does yellow. Those are kind of your options there. And so now that we kind of see what that is doing in terms of the black and white conversion, let's go and start with the green filter. And then we're just going to select our multiply blending mode. And again, we're going to turn down the opacity, let's say to something like maybe 36%. And then I'm going to grab a curve and just going to brighten it back up just to give me that nice effect in the skin tone, but I don't want my overall image to be quite this dark. So something like that, and again, we'll just group this together. You can call it really anything you want, contrast, luminosity, whatever you want. It doesn't really matter as long as it's kind of grouped together so we can see the effect of those two layers together. And so the effect of it is basically that, and that's sort of giving us that initial base of drama in our shot. Now before I go on to the rest, just again, as with any other image that we've talked about within this tutorial, the same kind of things have been done to get to this point. Dodge and burn and some healing, and that's it. And again, with the dodge and burn, if you're curious, just take a look at the dodge and burn course that I have for Retouching Academy. That's the process I use every single time. So let's work on the blacks first. So we're going to grab a selective color. And again, here we have obviously a lot of blacks. So we can really play with those to kind of create a variety of effects. Let's just label this blacks. Going into the blacks color here. And again, if we want to kind of pull some of that contrast out, we could maybe take the black point down by 1 or 2. Maybe we'll do that later. I find it's best to kind of leave that for the end to kind of go back and make an adjustment, because once we start playing with these colors, it will kind of distort the actual black point a bit as well. So there's no sense in sort of adjusting it before you get the colors right. Very rarely do I want to add yellow because it creates a pretty ugly effect overall. I don't really care for that color grade. Something like blue could work really nicely here. I mean, we could do something like this. Let's go with it. Let's create this sort of exaggerated version, and then we'll go back and we'll try something that's a little bit more neutral. So maybe something like this, maybe add a touch of cyan to it. Maybe we can, I don't think I want to add magenta. If anything, maybe just take a bit of magenta away. Let's see. We'll just actually leave magenta as is. Maybe we'll play with it with color balance later. And in terms of the black point, I think we'll go -1 here just to pull out a tiny bit of that contrast. So let's assume that that's our sort of starting point. With those two adjustment layers, we've created the bulk of the actual color grade. We've really sort of dictated the direction we're going to take this image in. So the next thing I want to do is I'm not going to bother with selective color on whites because there's no real heavy, strong whites. If I'm going to adjust the highlights, I'm going to do it through color balance because it will, as we kind of saw, it affects a broader range of the highlights as opposed to the actual whites option within selective color. So I think the next one I'm going to do is I'm going to do selective color on the skin tone, and I'm going to drop it below this blacks adjustment because, again, the blacks were distorting color so much by adding all of that blue. It's going to be a little bit harder to pick out skin tone. So I'm going to do it below that particular layer. Let's call this skin. All right. And then we're going to go into yellows, and I want to add maybe a little bit of red to it. So just to kind of make the skin pop a little bit more, maybe a little red, maybe a little bit of magenta, and maybe a little bit more yellow. And again, we want to add the yellow because the yellow kind of orange complements nicely with the blue that we have in our shadows. And then as far as the black point there, the tint and shade, let's just kind of pull that down a tiny bit, something like that. And, I haven't actually done this color grade on this image before. This is just kind of me experimenting. So this is, you're seeing it the way I sort of normally do it. Just trial and error. I might try one color grade and then try another one and kind of see which one feels right to me. That's generally the way I kind of approach this this sort of thing. So now that we're going to move on to highlights with color balance, it doesn't really matter where we put it because we're not targeting a color. We're targeting a particular luminosity range. So let's go ahead and grab our color balance. And then within here, I just want to kind of look at the highlights. And so we could maybe grab the highlights and pull them more towards the cyan side of things. I don't particularly care for too much green in there, but maybe just a little bit. We'll do like a +1. And then, we could go this way where we cool down some of the highlights, or we could go this way where we warm some of them up. I'm actually going to warm them up a little bit, again, to give a little bit of sort of, color contrast between the blue tones, the cool shadows. We'll have the warmer highlights. And actually, now that I look at it, the green in there is sort of bothering me. So I'm going to go back into there and just wipe that out. All right. I know it's a subtle thing, but it's bugging me nonetheless. And I'm going to just take this down to -7. So as you can see, it is a bit of an iterative process. And then let's go ahead and go into hue saturation, and we are going to finish this off. And so we can label this too, by the way. It's always good practice to kind of know what that's targeting in case you want to make an adjustment later. And so in here, we're going to grab our yellows again, and let's just see if we want to maybe desaturate a little bit. I don't really want to play with the hue. I always just kind of slide it side to side just to see if there is a particular side that makes the skin look a little bit better. In this case, I don't really think it does much. If we start playing with this, it will basically start messing around with some of the saturation, which sometimes can look okay if used subtly, but generally speaking, not something I use too often. So let's go ahead and take that down to, let's say, -10, and then let's go to reds and just see if we want to take those down a little bit. So yeah, I think something like maybe -9, -8 looks pretty good there. And then one thing I always take a look at here as well, when I have that strong kind of blue cast in the shadows, it's good to just grab blues there and let's just sample a blue color so that it adjusts our range here. And it's good to just kind of play with the saturation, see if we want to lower it at all. If we find that this is maybe a little too overboard for the look we're looking for, we don't want it to be quite that dramatic, we can just kind of take that down a notch and just desaturate it a little bit. Obviously, if we take it too far, then we're sort of neutralizing things again, and we don't want to do that because that was the whole point of putting it in there in the first place. But maybe, slightly desaturated would be a good thing there. So that is that color grade there.